Cool. All right, recording. Um, Sweet. So, what questions do we got? Or,
I mean, I guess to start things off, it's not as much a specific question, but I was looking back over the lectures for the unit last night, and I feel like, in particular, the soil lecture had a lot in it, and I just kind of do you think you could give like maybe a couple minute quick recap of that lecture, just like the most important points from that, because I feel like that and the reading associated with it had a lot in there.
yeah, it's one of those days where 50 minutes, we go over like a 50-page chapter. Um, all right, let's, let's, all righty. Where's that? All right. Um, So yeah, there's a lot of information in here because the soil in itself could be in its entire own class, right? Just in terms of like microorganisms, ecosystems, things of that nature. So what I would like you all to know about soil for this exam um, is I want you to know how like the different types of soil. So the different layers that occur in terms of sand versus clay, what their properties are, why for instance, so clay is clay, sand, and silt are all particle diameters, just varying ranges of what um, you know ground, dirt, broken down rocks and matter can be, right? So the fact that clay is very inhospitable, as well as sand, generally speaking, for plants, there's obviously something, life will find a way. But clay in itself is very, very small particles, which allows them to hold on to water. And so that causes difficulty for plants because plants are unable to breathe. They can't get any oxygen because the clay is holding onto too much water. You then have sand, which are huge particles, and so those have the exact opposite problem, right? They're so big that they don't um, hold on to water, and in fact, it makes it less stable for plants. So plants have a harder time like righting themselves and keeping themselves able to point in the right direction, but it also doesn't hold on to uh, water very well. And so there is this kind of, all these particles, right? They're not just going to be, all with the same type, right? You're going to slowly break down rocks, you're going to have erosion. And so you're going to have areas transitioning between these different states. And so most soils have a combination of clay, silt, and sand, some combination of particle sizes in them. And so there's this loam area, which are combined parts of small amounts of silt and clay. And so these loam areas are really the type of soil that's most hospitable for plants. So knowing that you have this area, but if you get the particles get too small or the particles start getting too big, you can start having more difficulties. But Loam is kind of that intermediate that allows for, different particle sizes. So it holds on to minerals, it allows water to flow, but it also allows for there to be oxygen. Um, and so knowing the difference between like loam, clay, sand, um, in general, I think is important. Um, Also, soil is kind of building on this idea that we talked about before, right? Of plants kind of dictating an environment. And so, soil is also dictating what kind of plants are in an environment. So, soil, it has this, this effect upwards during the uh, food chain and trophic levels. And so the reason that we talk about plants dictating stuff is because plants are actually alive, right? They're organisms that are actively living and trying to survive in their environments. But soil is ultimately deciding what plants can grow, right? We have that ecological succession that happens. And so the thing I would like you to know additionally is, why does soil composition affect what can grow, right? Well, it's because you have micro organisms in it, right? Fungi, insects, bacteria, all of these organisms are going to be interacting with one another. And in fact, there's so much bacteria in there that it's impossible to really think of truly how many are there. And so this allows, these organisms are acting in a number of different cycles, right? Nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and they're helping provide the appropriate nutrients for plants. And so knowing that, plants are interacting with the inorganic and organic components in soil in order to survive, right? You have soil particles, which are holding on to different types of cations that you need in order to survive, right? Plants will need calcium, phosphorus, um, magnesium in small amounts. And so I'd like you to know about that. Just, if I ask you a question about this question is mostly going to be one of the short answers, right? How does soil affect plants, and how do plants and how do they help dictate ecosystems? I think is most important. There's a lot of this other stuff, such as um, plant symbiosis and fungi. I'm not as interested in that, but knowing that nitrogen fixation, I think is also another very important part of this cycle. Um, you know, and so we actually have another question that I think segues well into this, which is why are prokaryotes' ability to carry out, multiple functions important for environments, right? So, prokaryotes, bacteria are all acting as part of these cycles, right? And so, one important thing about them is that they connect a lot of different trophic levels and a lot of different chemical cycling and reactions. So, for instance, right? And in order to do that, these bacteria, these protists, are not doing the same, biological functions, right? They're doing that resource allocation differences, right? So for instance, you have bacteria that are living by fixating nitrogen. You have bacteria that are, ammonifying nitrogen. You then have bacteria that are acting as intermediate steps, right? Taking that ammonia, turning it into ammonium, or taking that ammonium and turning it into nitrate. You then have those protist bacteria that are acting as decomposers and returning nutrients to the soil, breaking down organic matter. And so, again, any of these like different trophic levels we can think of are possible because of protists. They're the invisible little, wiggling hand that is doing a lot of these important biochemical, geobiochemical cycles and behaviors in order. Yeah, and so that is what's allowing plants to grow, allowing ultimately higher level organisms to grow. And part of that is there's all this diversity in how they undergo these processes. Yeah, so I hope that answers those questions. Yeah, let's see. Then we have another question. Why is it we have biofilms in a general sense? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Like, why do they exist in nature? Or, um, oh, why are they important? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so biofilms are important for a number of reasons. Let me do, do, do. Biofilms are important because um, they show not symbiosis. They show wow, I'm really bad with words today. I'm sorry, guys. They show a mutualism between organisms and between species. And biofilms are also important because they allow different species to thrive in environments that they normally wouldn't. Um, and biofilms also grow on pretty much anything. So there's something that we have to deal with. A big industry is just how do we get bacteria to stop clinging to pipes, in sewage treatment plants, in our homes, right? How do we stop bacteria from forming biofilms? It's an issue that we have to deal with in our own life, right? If you look at um, say when we're like pump even if we're pumping like oil pipelines, things that go over the ocean, there are always bacteria that will deposit themselves and be there. So um and so yeah, and so biofilms in a general sense are a collection of bacteria. Think of how we were discussing the corals as being a meta-organism, how you have multiple species and creatures coming together to kind of be one entity. That's what a biofilm is in a sense. So you have bacteria, some type of primary bacteria species that'll land somewhere and start attaching. They'll start to then secrete some type of goo, biofilms. They're called biofilms because they're usually wet and sticky and gross. Think of like a bacterial blob you would see in like any type of like weird movie, if there's a scientist or something. Um, and so after you have those first bacteria that are living there, they usually then change the environment around them, again with that goo, into a way that makes it the environment hospitable for other species. And so you'll have secondary, tertiary, depending on the biofilm, any number of different types of bacteria that will come together and they will start doing different jobs. And so they're doing this symbiosis and they're doing something, for example, here we have bacteria that want to undergo both photosynthesis and respiration, right? That you need nitrogen in order to undergo photosynthesis. And so what happens is these bacteria, most of them were photosynthesized, but because creation of nitrogen fixation has to occur in the absence of oxygen, you have certain other bacteria that are forming these specialized cells and areas that are blocking out oxygen. And so these heterocysts, these organisms are able to create nitrogen, and then they'll share that nitrogen with the other organisms. And so, biofilms are important in the fact that they are their own little environments within, a larger ecosystem. And, they have a lot of ramifications for our own lives, but also each other. And so continuing with this, um, for the types of evolutionary niches that prokaryotes use in the environment are everything. Prokaryotes are involved in, at some level, some species in every one of those important geochemical um, um, cycles. So For instance, there's 4 of them that I talked about specifically. You have phototropes and chemotropes, so organisms that are making energy from the sun or making it from chemicals. And so in each case, they're acting as primary producers in an environment, right? This happens in aquatic environments, this happens in soil, this happens, on land. Prokaryotes are providing initial energy for high level organisms, just like plants are. You need prokaryotes like you need plants to create energy. Um, then you have these other 2, which are more vague, and I'm not going to ask you as specifically, but you have organisms that are autotrophs and those that are heterotrophs. So autotrophs only need a source of carbon in order to make their energy. Um, most things are heterotrophs in which they need other organic nutrients. So for instance, they need glucose to make their organic compounds. So another way to think of this is autotrophs create their own energy, whereas heterotrophs are usually taking it in another form from another organism. So autotrophs are often, phototrophs. They'll make their own energy from the sun, and they're an autotroph. Heterotrophs would be everything else. But the point is that these organisms, when we look at chemical cycling, right, they're going to, phytoplankton are going to be making energy from the sun. They're going to be eaten by something, say by zooplankton, some slightly bigger protists, right, amoebas, things like that. They're then going to die. When they die, when they excrete poop, they're going to be adding nutrients back into the environment, say this waste. For instance, in aquatic systems, both phytoplankton and zooplankton, when they die, they fall down in the ocean, and they actually are providing carbon when they get eaten at lower levels. They're then being decomposed by bacteria, and bacteria are returning nutrients to the environment. And so, this is just one system. This can be different in soil or things of that nature. But in every case, they're filling in all these gaps in these biochemicals, energy, transportation cycles. And so they really are allowing ecosystems to thrive and continue to survive. Yeah, cool. All right, sweet. And so, when we're talking about prokaryotes, we're talking about these, single-celled organisms. And so the primary difference between bacteria and archaea are that bacteria are generally a little bit bigger, but they have a different cell wall and cell membrane structure than archaea. So bacteria are more similar to us in the fact that they have a phospholipid bilayer in which it's made of fats, right? They have these dual level dew layer, surrounding their cell. They also have cell walls. They're a little bit more protective. They have other stuff in there, but they have that membrane layer. Archaea, on the other hand, instead of having fatty acids um, as their cell wall, they have isoprene instead. Ooh, that's very loud. Sorry. They have isoprene instead. And so this allows them to be a lot more sturdy. Isoprene is a much stronger material, and it also helps connect their phospholipid bilayer. So think of it as the same kind of structure where you have the hydrophobic head, hydrophilic head on the outside, and then you have hydrophobic in the middle. But isoprene is just a different chain in the middle that keeps them together. And so archaea are primarily known as extremophiles. So not only do they not make us sick, but they live in very ridiculous environments such as extreme temperature, acidity, or other chemical concentrations. Um, so let's see. And then we have how are both energy and mass conserved and converted in the ecosystem? All right. So, um, so in an ecosystem, we have two things, right? And these are laws of thermodynamics. We have conservation of energy and we have conservation of mass. Neither of them can be destroyed. They're simply transferred in forms, right? And so in an ecosystem, energy is coming in from the sun, with the exception of the ecosystems in which you have the vents, those vents on the floor in which you have chemosynthesis happening because there's no sunlight. But for the most part, sunlight is coming in and then being picked up by primary producers. And so energy is lost due to um, metabolic processes, often generally lost as heat. But with the exception of that energy that's lost as heat, energy is constantly flowing up the trophic level. Energy is moving from organism to organism by being eaten and by being devoured. The only exception to that is with decomposers who are returning that energy back to the soil by breaking down dead matter. Um, and so energy is always going from producers up into consumers. Um, Chemicals, conservation of mass are constantly being cycled though. It's constantly being changed form when you have these different types of chemicals in the environment, right? So for instance, going back to the nitrogen cycle, right? You have nitrogen that's in the air that is then being fixated by bacteria and then being turned into a new form. That new form is then being picked up by another organism and then being changed form yet again. So you're never losing that material from the environment, except in the case, remember when we were talking about how we like transfer food a lot, right? We grow food and crops in an area, and then we take those and move them away. In a natural environment, that nitrogen would eventually get eaten by something in the environment, and it would be returned into the cycle. So it's never destroyed; it's always changed form and passed on, hopefully cyclically, allowing life to continue. Right. Whereas energy is constantly being lost and constantly being moved up trophic levels. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. Let's see. And so let's see. So we have another question, which is how and why do nutrients limit life? Well, that one's fairly simple, right? Um, we have a lot of metabolic processes. We have inefficiency in our energy production, in our nutrient production, protein, all of that. And so we need to have the appropriate molecules in order to undergo those processes, right? If you do not have phosphorus, you cannot make ATP. You cannot possibly make your DNA. Same thing that goes for nitrogen. If you don't have nitrogen, you can't undergo respiration, you can't create any of your essential amino acids or your DNA or anything like that. And so in every case, if you don't have enough nutrients, you can't sustain things. It's just like not having enough food. If you're eating an organism that's also malnutritious and it's not giving you any nitrogen or giving you phosphorus, you're not going to be able to survive even if you ate, right? You can eat things and still not be healthy. And so each of these chemicals in an environment will limit some species, right? Some species that's not able to get enough water will not be able to reproduce as much. Maybe it'll die. Some species that's not going to get enough carbon, depending on where it is, this is the whole reason why natural selection is a thing, right? You're going to have organisms that are consuming things and they're going to compete with one another for nutrients. Obviously, sometimes you're eating other organisms in order to get those nutrients, but um, all of those follow the same thing. You need energy, you need nitrogen, you need all of these to undergo metabolic processes. Um, and so, yeah, the lack of nutrients, it will limit life and not the nutrients themselves. Unless, of course, you're in an environment where there's too much. There can obviously be too much nutrients, right? So you can be in a flood, right? You can be in a flooded area and have too much water that's being forced into your body, right? So generally, it's the availability of nutrients that limits life in an area, but there can definitely be examples where those excess nutrients can inhibit and make homeostasis more difficult. So like in environments for the most part, like nitrogen is the primary thing that limits plant growth, the availability of enough nitrogen in the soil to continuously grow. Which if you ever watched The Office, Dwight talks about, and he's completely right.
Could we talk about what an extinction vortex is and then why smaller populations would go extinct faster?
Sure. All right. Right. So extinction vortexes, right, are there are fancy way of talking about why and how populations start to decline, right? We're trying to talk about this less in a natural selection type of way and more in a, population viability type of way, right? So you have small populations of organisms, which means that you don't have that many who may be reproducing. Think about it in terms of the fact that, like, not only do these organisms need to reproduce, but they need to survive and they also need to find one another. And so extinction vortex is the sad process by which a small population, generally without any genetic variation, is unable to acclimate to their environment, or they are pushed out of their niche by another organism, right? So you have, say, a bunch of, marsupials, those little rodents that are mass producing, right? That we talked about, the ones that do the once in a lifetime mating before they die. If their population is too small, you're going to start having less and less genetic variation within them, which means they're going to be more and more similar, which may or may not be advantageous in their environment. And if you think about it, it doesn't, their traits need to be able to help them survive. They don't need to be the most fit, but they need to be able to outcompete other organisms in their environment for their respective resources. These organisms need to compete for nitrogen, phosphorus, all of that. And so what'll happen is, as they continue to breed with one another, you have less and less genetic diversity, which means they're less likely to be able to deal with any types of sudden changes in environment, or disease or things of that nature. And so you have genetic variability losing. And then generally speaking, and obviously this doesn't need to happen, say you're an invasive species and you're doing really well in your environment, this isn't a problem. But generally, this process lowers fitness. Generally, having less genetic variability makes it so that your offspring are more likely to die, or from disease or being picked off or anything like that. And so that lower fitness leads to lower overall reproduction, and then lower and higher mortality and higher death. And so that makes the population smaller. And so this process just continues for generations until that small population is completely gone. And so scientists like to talk about a minimal viable population, or the minimal amount of organisms you need in order to keep reproducing and keep those numbers alive. Was that, did I explain that enough?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. How are invasive species a form of natural selection? Cool. Let's see this PowerPoint. What? I can't remember. No. Sorry. Which one is it? This one? Oh, the worst. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So in terms of invasive species, I was just trying to get at the idea that in these environments, right, you have organisms that are allocating resources to different things. They are attempting to produce as much as possible. And that's going to obviously come into conflict because there are limited nutrients, right? And so invasive species are acting as essentially introducing an invasive species can be like an organism that is hyper adapted for its environment, right? Perhaps an organism is, say, this, protist is used to being raised in an environment where if it reproduces too much, it gets eaten by something else. Or perhaps it has low nitrogen, say, yeah, low nitrogen in the environment. When it moves to a new environment that may not have the right predators or an ample right amount of nutrients, say nitrogen, those bacteria can now grow exponentially fast. They're then going to outcompete all of the local organisms, say this other protist down here. And so it is going to, prokaryote down here, it's going to decline, right? And those numbers are going to start to, that population is going to start to enter that extinction vortex, right? You have this competition between the species leading to the death of another. And so though it's not a direct evolution like natural selection, it's not direct evolution, because these organisms aren't just evolving willy-nilly with each other, they're just being quickly introduced. It's the same thing, right, as one species from natural selection pushing out another, right? You have the extinction vortex being exacerbated by lack of resources and things like that.
For question 14, it says, how do we quantify the properties of soil? Would that be like by texture and the size of the particles?
Yeah, so texture and size of the particles, and then the levels of nutrients in it,
Okay.
right? Like its availability of nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could we talk a little bit about what pathogenic bacteria means and then why that would affect humans?
Yeah, sure. All right, so in the most basic sense, we're just talking about like medical conditions, right? The cool thing about archaea is they don't seem to like to live in people, which is convenient. I think weird, but convenient. But bacteria, we are forming relationships with bacteria all the time, right? They're in our gut, they're all over us. Not all of them are bad, right? Some of them are doing really good things for us. But not every bacteria cares about us. Not every bacteria is going to, make sure that it's not producing chemicals that are, say, noxious to us, right? Think again of the corals, right? Corals have those symbiotic relationships with algae. Those algae are generally okay, right? They're making material, they're sharing resources, they're surviving together. And that's how we work with bacteria too. But there are species that will make us sick. They evolve some type of chemical that can hurt us, or they just reproduce too much and they start taking nutrients from us, right? You can have things such as, malaria and different types of pathogens that can live in your blood, and, you feel sick and you feel weak because those bacteria are making it so you can't possibly, produce the appropriate nutrients you want or sustain yourself with a proper amount of energy. And so, yeah, bacteria um, are all around us in our environment, and we have issues with antibiotic resistance, right? We have clean spaces such as NASA and or hospitals that are constantly being cleaned, and they constantly are exposing bacteria to many different types of antibiotics and cleaners, which means that if any of them survive and or get a method of resisting that antibiotic, everything else in that lineage afterward is most likely going to also be resistant, right? They're probably going to pass that on to their offspring because, they're splitting in half, right? They're just replicating. And so bacteria have a fundamental, effect on our lives and a fundamental effect on how we have to conduct ourselves simply because they can make us sick. Um, Anyone have any other questions?
For question 3 on the study guide, it says, would you consider humans to have a positive or negative effect on biodiversity? Um, I definitely see the ways in which they can have a negative effect, but I was having trouble finding ways that they may have a positive effect.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess in that question, kind of the way that we're having a positive effect is, some of us are having a positive effect, right? um, is the idea of, this conservation ecology, right, and restoration ecology. So the fact that, we're taking places such as, the Vassar Farm, and we are treating it and trying to keep it isolated from our own development, right? We're trying to lower, where is it? Sorry, we're trying to lower, our over harvesting, our habitat loss, and, even some of us are trying to deal with climate change and invasive species, right? So people are actively working to identify the issues that we're causing in the environment and trying to fix those, right? We have plots at Vassar that are all of these varying stages of ecological succession, right? And so this is going to create a lot of different sub-environments that different insects and animals can inhabit. And so we're working on helping biodiversity in that way. Yeah, just actively working that way. That, if a question like that would be on an exam, that would be like essentially an opinion question. And as long as you defended your side well enough, then it would be good. It's similar to a question I asked on, Bio 108, which is like, are humans evolving, right? Um, and so, yeah, cool.
I think you said in class yesterday, but I forgot. So the recapture for quiz 6 is when is that due?
So let me see. So final grades are due, what is it? The end of next week. So, right, yeah, because I think finals week ends on the 6th. So as long as you hand it in at some time next week, that's fine. I'm not putting a specific, I'm not putting on this, as long as you get it in by like the 4th, I can give you credit for the recapture.
Oh.
Let's see, are we getting a study guide for the final exam? Not specifically. This final exam covers like the key concepts from each of the units. So if you use like the unit study guides, you're gonna have more than enough for the final. I would say reviewing it. Once again, there are three or four multiple choice for each section, and then 2 short answers and a fill in the blank for each unit. So I would use the study guides that we had prior.
I know you already went over this, and I'm sorry if it's like you're repeating yourself, but I was just a little still a little confused about the rhizobacteria and then the mycorrhizae bacteria. You could just go over that a little bit more.
Oh, okay. So in terms of these fungi, right, and these symbiotic relationships that are being formed between plants and between plants and their environments. So I'm not going to ask you specifics about, say, like the difference is in these types of fungi, right? Like the differences between the ones that actively invade cells versus the ones that sit in between them. For this class, what I want you to understand is the role that they play in that greater, set of biogeochemical cycles, right? So in each case, they're forming some type of symbiotic relationship, right? This fungi is doing very similar things to those bacteria. You have those that are sharing nutrients, the plant is providing sugars from photosynthesis, and then the fungus is, extending the range to which the roots can grow, but they also absorb other nutrients from the environment, right, which can then be passed on to the plant in itself via its roots, either passively um, or actively being pumped, depending on it. And so, this happens in a lot of different ways, right? So you have this nitrogen fixation, which again is, I think, that most important part, right? Nitrogen is primarily what's limiting, primarily what's limiting nutrients in the environment and growth. And so, for instance, you have these bacteroids, right, that are living around the plant roots. Let's see. Think of it as, the same thing that's happening in this prokaryotes one, right? Where we have these biofilms that are being produced, where some are producing nitrogen and some are producing sugars. That is exactly the same type of relationship that's happening here, right? We have certain types of bacteria that need no oxygen. So they're going to form these nodules on the plant. They're then going to undergo nitrogen fixation since oxygen is blocked from entering. And now they can use that nitrogen, and they can also release excess nitrogen into the surrounding area, which would then be where plants are going to pick it up. And so I would like you to know that aspect of it. Again, nitrogen fixation, how the presence of these fungi and bacteria are allowing plants and making it so that plants can survive more readily in an environment that they normally would not be able to without that relationship.
Could we go over the difference between NEP and GPP?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I'm just checking something and making sure. Yeah, so just making sure that I didn't, where is it? So I was just checking. I don't ask you any questions about this type of production, environmental production. So what I want you to know about this idea in general is this, the fact that when we are talking about an environment, when we're talking about the number of organisms that can be sustained, especially at higher trophic levels, it all depends on how much energy is entering the system, right? We said that energy is always being lost. And not only is energy always being lost, it has to be, passed on from organism to organism. So if there's not energy being created by the primary producers, then there's not any new energy that can be added to the system to sustain higher level organisms. And so we have two things. So we have, let's start here. We have net primary production, NPP, which is the amount of energy used by a producer and the amount of energy produced by a producer, right? Yeah, so you have, energy that's being produced by them. You then have in an ecosystem, you have the amount of biomass that's added by producers and consumers, right? So organisms are losing heat, but they're eating, they're adding fat, they're adding mass their plants are growing. And so NEP is the amount of biomass that's added in addition to sustaining yourself. So there's energy that's being put into just maintenance, right? And then there's energy that's put into growth or reproduction. And so the net ecosystem production would be the amount of additional body mass essentially that's being added by the primary producers and then each consumer eating the thing below it. And obviously this is not fully efficient, right? The GPP is the gross production or the total amount of energy that's being produced by all organisms in an environment, right? And by respiration, we mean energy, right? The amount of energy they're producing. And so that includes energy that is actually being utilized by the organism themselves, right? So we're trying to figure out how much the organism is using and then how much it's producing. And so gross is all of that energy, even the stuff that's lost. So everything that's being created in an environment and all of this energy that's being lost. And that can be pretty hard to gauge. So that's GPP. And NEP is just the physical amount of mass, none of this lost energy, just how much of this is created in each level. And then net primary is how much energy is leaving this stage, right? How much energy is being produced by a plant and then is not being utilized by a plant by something else that's eating it. But I'm not going to ask you any questions on the quiz about these forms of energy production or these different terms rather for measuring it.
Can you please explain how bacteria and plants have a mutualistic relationship in the nitrogen cycle? I know bacteria makes nitrogen available for plants, but then what do the bacteria get out of it?
So, if we go back to this, right? Bacteria are getting a lot of nutrients from the plants in themselves, right? They're living in these nodules. And so they're getting sugars directly from the plant. And so in the nitrogen cycle, you have plants that are producing extra sugars, extra things like that. You have these symbiotic relationships between the bacteria and the roots generally, but it can be other parts of the plant. And so they're getting sugars, they're getting other nutrients they may not readily know, have, right? Roots are secreting, root fluid, right, to help digest and absorb things from their surroundings. And so those nutrients can also be passed on to these bacteria. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I guess could we talk about question 2 on the study guide a little bit, which is what factors affect biodiversity and distribution of species?
Yeah. Right. So this is like a, a continuation of um, things that we were talking about last unit, right? The idea that um, organisms are going to be interacting with one another and they're going to be limited for a number of different reasons, right? They can be limited by, as we said, absence of nutrients, right? So by abiotic factors, we could have, too much water, not enough water, things of that nature. But in an environment, we also are having all of these um, biotic interactions, right? So predation, um, uh, plant mutualism, right? If you have plants that need those certain bacteria in order to produce nitrogen in order to survive, those plants can only live in areas that have those available nutrients. And so if you think again of ecological succession, right, you have buildup of communities over time because you need to build up these different feedback loops and different trophic levels, right? You need to have the settlement of the soil. That soil needs to have enough nutrients in order for bacteria and fungi in order to start growing, in order for plants to start forming mutualistic relationships. And then those organisms then start providing food for other organisms in the environment. And so that ecosystem starts to slowly build up that way. And so there are just all of these different interactions that are very, very important. So you have, abiotic factors, biotic factors, all these interactions between organisms, and then you have the actual behavior of the organism themselves, right? Certain organisms understand their bodies, right? They know homeostasis, they know what is the appropriate factors that they need in terms of concentrations of water and things like that. And so organisms will also limit their distribution based on their own behavior, right? If I've learned that I can only, survive if I lay my eggs in a certain tree, that species is only going to be found where that tree is, right? Or, when it comes to invasive species, the reason that they are not limited in their distribution is because none of these factors exist, right? There's no biotic factor that is keeping them, in check. There's no predators. There's no abiotic factor, right? They're not poisoned by the air or the water or anything like that, right? There's not too strange of a pH that could be affecting them. And so those organisms are just going to be limited by their own behavior. And if, they are like a plant that's really good at, say, growing from its roots, or it has a lot of seeds that it sprays, it's just going to constantly, be spreading out. And so its distribution will not be limited. So I just, in that case, kind of think of a species, say, hypothetically, like a grasshopper, what factors can you think of that might stop that grasshopper's offspring from spreading out everywhere, right?
Could you also say like in the other slideshow there was like habitat loss, over harvesting, climate change, natural disturbance, and invasive species. So like that, and then everything you just said, those could all be answers.
Yeah, right. So let's see. Yeah, this PowerPoint about the conservation, right? These are all threats to biodiversity, right? These are all things that are going to limit organisms distribution. I guess this is more of like specific what we're actively doing and causing. But you're exactly there. They all fall in those biotic, abiotic areas. You're exactly right. Great.
Professor,
Mm-hmm.
there was like a question on the study guide, like question 9, how do prokaryotes vary from eukaryotic cells? Did you mean like their difference in cell structure or like their impact on the ecosystem?
I was just talking, and that specific question was just talking about like their cell structure, right? The fact that they're like bacteria, they're they're much simpler, right? They have a cell wall. They have their DNA is just in a circle. It's just inside of them. They don't have, this separation of nucleus and things like that. Yeah, it also is important. There are differences in the environment, right? In those cell cycles, but I mean, in the geochemical cycles and such. But I think that's handled by the other questions. So.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just go back for a second? So would all like the things I listed, like habitat loss, climate change, those things, like are those all biotic since we're like amplifying them, like the effects of them? Or would it be like over harvesting is biotic, but climate change is abiotic?
Yeah, so climate change would be abiotic. Climate change is a slew of different things, but primarily it's non-living things, right? You have the changing, concentrations of different things in the soil, water cycles, different, all of these non-living things like air. Over harvesting would be, I guess technically that would be a biotic factor because, as humans, we are causing that. We are the source of that. And we're also destroying home, right? Their homes and like generally, killing trees and stuff like that, right? So, I wouldn't ask you to define whether overharvesting is biotic or abiotic, but it can theoretically kind of be either. But yeah, they fall under those umbrellas. Any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.